The bitter Montana winter of 1881 had no mercy for the desperate. When rancher Matthew Kane discovered a half-frozen woman and her infant son collapsed near his property line, he made a choice that seemed simple enough: bring them inside before they died in the snow. But the woman he saved wasn't just another frontier widow seeking shelter. She was Morning Star, daughter of Chief Red Cloud of the Lakota, and her presence on his isolated ranch would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, family, and the deadly politics of the American frontier. Chapter 1. The Frozen Refugees. The Montana wind cut through the February afternoon like a blade forged in the Arctic, carrying snow that stung exposed skin and turned breath into crystalline clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. Matthew Kane pulled his wool coat tighter as he rode the fence line of his sprawling cattle ranch, checking for breaks that could spell disaster for his herd during the brutal winter of 1881. At 35, Matthew had weathered 8 winters on this unforgiving land, carving out a modest but sustainable operation from the raw wilderness. His ranch, the Double Arrow, sat in a valley 30 miles west of Fort Benton, where the rolling plains met the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The isolation that had initially attracted him to this location now served as both protection and vulnerability in a territory where tensions between settlers and Native American tribes remained dangerously high. As he guided his horse along the weathered fence posts, Matthew's attention was drawn to an unusual dark shape in the snow near his property's eastern boundary. At first glance, it appeared to be debris blown by the storm, perhaps a fallen tree branch or abandoned equipment. But as he approached, the shape resolved into something that made his blood freeze in his veins. 2 human figures lay motionless in a shallow depression beside a cluster of bare cottonwood trees. The larger form was clearly a woman, her dark hair stark against the white snow, wearing a mixture of traditional Native American clothing and what appeared to be a worn settler's coat. Clutched against her chest was a bundle of blankets that could only contain an infant. Matthew dismounted quickly, his boots crunching through the knee-deep snow as he approached the still forms. The woman was unconscious but breathing, her lips blue with cold and her skin bearing the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia. Frost had formed on her eyelashes and around her mouth, indicating she had been exposed to the elements for hours, possibly overnight. The bundle in her arms stirred weakly, revealing the face of an infant who could not have been more than a few months old. The child was wrapped in what appeared to be a traditional cradleboard, its construction suggesting skilled craftsmanship and cultural significance. Despite the desperate circumstances, the baby was still alive, though clearly suffering from the same exposure that threatened its mother. Matthew faced an immediate and complex decision. Taking in these 2 individuals would violate federal policies regarding contact with Native Americans, potentially marking him as a collaborator with what the government classified as hostile forces. The military patrols that regularly swept the territory would view any assistance to Native Americans as treasonous, punishable by imprisonment or worse. But leaving them to die was not an option his conscience could accept. The woman had clearly traveled far in desperate circumstances, risking everything to reach some unknown destination. Her choice to flee into the deadly winter with an infant spoke to desperation so profound that death in the snow seemed preferable to whatever she was escaping. Without further hesitation, Matthew lifted the woman's unconscious form, noting how light she felt despite her adult frame. Malnutrition had clearly taken its toll during her ordeal. He carefully secured the infant against his chest, using his own coat to provide additional warmth, then managed to get both refugees across his saddle for the ride back to his ranch house. The journey back seemed endless, with the wind growing stronger and the snow falling more heavily with each passing minute. Matthew found himself speaking softly to both the woman and child, words of encouragement and promise that they would survive this trial. He had no way of knowing if they could understand English, but the sound of a human voice seemed important in the vast silence of the winter landscape. By the time Matthew reached his ranch house, both refugees showed signs of severe hypothermia that required immediate intervention. He carried them into his kitchen, the warmest room in the house, and began the careful process of gradually warming their bodies while avoiding the shock that could result from too rapid a temperature change. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Snow. The process of bringing the woman and child back from the edge of death consumed Matthew's entire first day. He worked methodically, warming their bodies with heated blankets and offering small sips of warm broth when consciousness flickered behind their eyelids. The woman drifted in and out of awareness, speaking words in what Matthew recognized as Lakota, though he understood none of the specific meanings. When she finally opened her eyes fully on the second morning, Matthew was struck by their unusual color. They were dark brown with flecks of green, suggesting mixed heritage that explained her distinctive features. She studied him with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect danger from unexpected quarters, but there was intelligence in her gaze that spoke of education and breeding. She introduced herself simply as Mary, offering no family name or tribal affiliation. Her English was precise and carefully pronounced, with only the slightest accent that suggested it was not her first language. When Matthew asked about her circumstances, she provided only the barest details. She was widowed, she explained, and traveling to find relatives when the storm had overtaken her. But Matthew noticed inconsistencies in her story that suggested careful omission rather than outright deception. Her clothing, while worn from travel, showed evidence of fine craftsmanship and expensive materials. The beadwork on her moccasins displayed patterns that Matthew had learned to associate with high-ranking tribal families. The infant's cradleboard was decorated with symbols and materials that spoke of wealth and status within Native American society. More telling were her unconscious behaviors and knowledge. When she prepared food, her movements displayed the confidence of someone accustomed to authority and resources. She identified herbs in Matthew's modest medicine collection with the expertise of a trained healer, suggesting formal education in traditional practices. Her posture and bearing, even in her weakened state, carried the dignity of someone who had never known subservience. The child, whom she called Little Wolf, responded to her touch and voice with the secure attachment of an infant who had known consistent, loving care. Despite their recent ordeal, the baby showed none of the developmental delays that Matthew would have expected from a child born into desperate circumstances. Instead, Little Wolf displayed the robust health and alertness of a child who had been well-nourished and carefully tended since birth. Matthew provided them with his guest room, a small but comfortable space that he had originally prepared for the occasional business visitor or traveling preacher. Mary accepted his hospitality with gracious dignity, neither servile in her gratitude nor presumptuous in her expectations. She insisted on contributing to the household work despite her recent trauma, demonstrating skills in cooking, cleaning, and childcare that reflected extensive training. During the long winter evenings, as they sat by the fire while Little Wolf slept, Matthew found himself drawn into conversations that revealed Mary's breadth of knowledge about territorial politics, military movements, and the complex relationships between various tribal groups and the federal government. Her insights were too detailed and current to have been gained through casual observation or secondhand reports. She spoke of recent treaty negotiations with the familiarity of someone who had been present during important discussions. Her knowledge of specific military officers and their personalities suggested direct contact with high-level government representatives. When she discussed the challenges facing Native American communities, her perspective carried the weight of personal investment rather than abstract sympathy. Matthew began to understand that he was sheltering someone whose true identity, if revealed, would place them both in extraordinary danger. Mary was clearly connected to the highest levels of tribal leadership, possibly through birth or marriage. Her flight into the winter wilderness with an infant suggested she was fleeing circumstances so threatening that death seemed preferable to capture. Yet despite his growing awareness of the risks involved in harboring her, Matthew found himself increasingly committed to providing protection for Mary and Little Wolf. Their presence had brought life and purpose to his isolated ranch in ways he had not anticipated. The The quiet intelligence in Mary's eyes and her dignified courage in the face of desperate circumstances had earned his respect, and he was beginning to realize something deeper than mere compassion. As the days passed and Mary regained her full strength, Matthew sensed that she was preparing to share the complete truth about her identity and circumstances. The careful way she observed his reactions and the questions she asked about his own loyalties suggested she was evaluating whether he could be trusted with information that could reshape both their futures. Chapter 3. The Truth Emerges. On the 7th evening of Mary's stay at the Double Arrow Ranch, she made her decision to trust Matthew with the truth that could endanger both their lives. As they sat beside the stone fireplace while Little Wolf slept peacefully, she turned to face Matthew directly, her unusual eyes reflecting the firelight with commanding intensity. She was not Mary, she explained, but Morning Star, daughter of the great Chief Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota. Her mixed heritage came from her mother, a white woman who had been captured during a raid and eventually became Red Cloud's second wife. This complicated ancestry had made Morning Star a bridge between two worlds, but also a target for those who saw her as a symbol of cultural compromise. The revelation explained everything Matthew had observed about her bearing, education, and knowledge of territorial politics. As Chief Red Cloud's daughter, Morning Star had been present at treaty negotiations and tribal councils that determined the fate of thousands across the frontier. Her flight had been triggered by her father's decision to arrange her marriage to a warrior named Burning Eagle, whose cruelty and ambition threatened to use her status for political advancement. Morning Star had refused the arrangement, knowing that marriage to such a man would make her a prisoner within her own family structure. Little Wolf was not the child of a deceased husband, but her son by a white cavalry officer named Captain James Morrison. Their relationship had developed during peace negotiations, conducted in secret due to explosive political implications. Morrison had been transferred east before learning of the child's existence. Her son's mixed heritage made him vulnerable to exploitation by factions within both societies. Military authorities would view him as evidence of unauthorized fraternization, while tribal elements would see him as a tool for manipulation against his mother's family. Matthew listened with growing awareness of the danger they faced. Harboring Chief Red Cloud's daughter would be viewed as treason by military authorities. Yet as he looked at Morning Star holding her son, he understood that her trust represented something more valuable than his personal safety. He would continue protecting them, regardless of consequences. Chapter 4. A Dangerous Alliance. Matthew spent the sleepless hours after Morning Star's revelation understanding the full magnitude of his situation. By dawn, he had made peace with the reality that his quiet life as an isolated rancher was over. Protecting Chief Red Cloud's daughter meant aligning himself against the most powerful forces in the Montana Territory. The practical preparations began immediately. Matthew moved his most valuable livestock closer to the house, where he could monitor them effectively. He cleaned and loaded every weapon on his property, positioning rifles at strategic locations throughout the ranch buildings. Most importantly, he began teaching Morning Star the layout of his land, showing her hidden trails and defensible positions. Morning Star proved to be a quick student in tactical preparation. Her knowledge of military strategies, gained through her father's counsels and treaty negotiations, complemented Matthew's understanding of the terrain. Together, they identified weaknesses in his defenses and developed contingency plans for various scenarios they might face. The greatest challenge lay in concealing Little Wolf's presence from unexpected visitors. Matthew constructed a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of his root cellar, large enough to accommodate both mother and child. The space was equipped with blankets, water, and enough supplies to sustain them for several hours if soldiers arrived without warning. Morning Star's insights into the political situation proved invaluable as Matthew tried to understand the forces aligned against them. She explained that her father's moderate stance toward white settlers had created enemies within his own tribe, warriors who viewed any cooperation with the government as betrayal. These faction leaders would see her capture as an opportunity to discredit Red Cloud's leadership. Equally dangerous were military commanders who had built their careers on the narrative that all Native Americans represented an existential threat to white settlement. Officers like Colonel Harrison at Fort Benning had no interest in peace negotiations that might eliminate the need for their services. Matthew realized their only hope for long-term survival lay in finding allies who could provide political protection against these threats. He began reaching out through carefully worded letters to contacts in territorial government, seeking individuals who might support a more moderate approach to Indian relations. Chapter 5. The Test of Loyalty. The test of Matthew's resolve came with the March thaw, when the sound of approaching horses shattered the morning calm at the Double Arrow Ranch. 8 cavalry soldiers rode in formation toward his property, their blue uniforms stark against the muddy landscape of early spring. Morning Star heard the hoofbeats and immediately understood the danger. Without a word, she gathered Little Wolf and moved swiftly toward the hidden compartment Matthew had prepared beneath the root cellar. Her movements were fluid and silent, the result of months spent preparing for exactly this moment. Matthew stepped onto his porch as the patrol approached, forcing his expression into the neutral mask of a rancher conducting ordinary business. The lead officer, Lieutenant Patterson, announced that his patrol was conducting a sweep for hostile Indians reported to have escaped from reservation lands. Failure to cooperate would be viewed as treason. Patterson's questions came rapidly, each designed to test Matthew's responses. Had he seen any Native Americans? Had anyone sought food or shelter? Matthew answered with practiced calm, mentioning distant smoke signals and occasional travelers seeking water, but insisting none had stayed longer than necessary. The lieutenant requested permission to search the outbuildings, clearly not optional despite its polite phrasing. The search proceeded methodically through barn, storage sheds, and corral areas. Matthew maintained a conversation about cattle and weather while internally monitoring every sound from the house. The most dangerous moment came when Patterson insisted on inspecting the main house. Matthew led them through the kitchen and living areas, noting how their eyes cataloged every detail. A wooden cradle sat in plain view, which Matthew explained as belonging to his deceased brother's family. In the root cellar, Patterson's boots passed directly over the hidden compartment where Morning Star and Little Wolf remained concealed. The lieutenant examined stored vegetables and preserved meats while mother and child maintained absolute silence despite the terrifying proximity of discovery. After 2 hours, Patterson declared the search complete, though his expression suggested he remained unconvinced. His parting words carried a warning that future vigilance was expected from all loyal citizens. Chapter 6. An Unbreakable Bond. As winter melted into spring and spring bloomed into summer, the dangerous sanctuary of the Double Arrow Ranch had transformed into something neither Matthew nor Morning Star had anticipated. What began as a desperate rescue had evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared courage, and understanding that transcended cultural boundaries. Morning Star's presence had brought purpose to Matthew's isolated existence, while her knowledge of tribal politics and military strategies proved invaluable in navigating the complex dangers they faced. Her insights helped him understand which officials might be sympathetic and which commanders posed the greatest threats. Matthew's unwavering protection had given Morning Star the security she needed to plan for her son's future. Through carefully arranged meetings with trusted intermediaries, she was able to send word to Chief Red Cloud that she and Little Wolf were safe, though she could not reveal their location. Little Wolf himself had become the bridge between their worlds, equally comfortable with his mother's Lakota lullabies and Matthew's English stories. His mixed heritage, once a source of danger, had become a symbol of possibility for understanding between cultures that seemed destined for conflict. The summer brought new challenges as increased travel through the territory meant more encounters with suspicious strangers. Patterson's continued interest required constant vigilance, but their successful concealment had proven their defensive preparations adequate. More importantly, Morning Star had begun establishing connections with moderate voices in both communities. Her father's reputation and her diplomatic skills opened doors to conversations about peaceful coexistence that might have been impossible under different circumstances. As autumn approached, Morning Star faced the reality that her sanctuary could not remain permanent. The political situation required her eventual return to tribal affairs, while Little Wolf needed to understand both sides of his heritage. Yet the bond forged during their months of shared danger had created something that would endure regardless of separation. They had proven that honor, courage, and compassion could overcome the hatred and fear dividing their peoples. If Matthew and Morning Star's story of courage across cultures inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true tales from the frontier. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to life. Their story would become part of the quiet history of the frontier, proof that individual acts of courage could plant seeds of understanding. Little Wolf would grow up knowing that courage and kindness could bridge any divide, carrying forward the legacy of two people who chose love over fear when it mattered most.